A camera trap set deep in the Colombian Llanos Orientales captured something in November of 2012 that stopped a research team cold. A group of small, brown, muscular animals moved together along a gallery forest corridor in the department of Guaviare. Not jaguars, not peccaries, not any of the species the camera had been deployed to monitor. The animals moved in formation. 4 of them visible in a single frame, trotting with the unmistakable coordination of pack hunters. The date stamp confirmed a daytime capture. That should have made identification easier. Instead, it made what they were seeing harder to believe. What the camera had captured was a pack of bush dogs, Speothos venaticus, Colombia's wolves, an animal so rarely documented in this country that most wildlife biologists working in the Llanos had never encountered one in the field. An animal first described from fossils, not from living specimens, because its bones were excavated from Brazilian caves before any living individual had ever been formally documented. An animal that had, by the best available evidence, been quietly disappearing from Colombia for decades, while almost nobody was watching. This is the story of how a pack-hunting canid that most Colombians have never heard of turned out to still be here, and what its reappearance reveals about what happens when decades of violence end and science finally walks into the silence. To understand why this matters, you need to know what was lost, or rather, what was almost lost, and why the losing happened so quietly. The bush dog is not a large animal. An adult weighs roughly 6 kilograms, about the size of a well-fed house cat, but its body plan is entirely built for cooperation. Short, powerful legs, a blunt, wide muzzle, dense brownish fur that sheds water. Partially webbed feet let it chase prey directly into rivers and streams without breaking stride. At first glance, it looks something between a weasel and a stumpy bear cub. It looks like it should be harmless. It is not harmless. The bush dog is one of only 4 hypercarnivorous canid species on Earth. It is South America's most socially coordinated mammalian predator, packs of up to 12 animals, organised around a dominant breeding pair, hunt with the kind of tactical precision that made early observers question whether they were really witnessing a canid at all. When a bush dog pack pursues a paca, a large rodent that routinely outweighs individual dogs, part of the pack drives it toward water. The other part waits in the water. The paca cannot escape both directions at once. It has no defense against a predator that thinks in 2 dimensions simultaneously. In one documented case, a pack of 6 bush dogs was observed hunting a South American tapir for 3 hours. A tapir weighs 250 kilograms, that is roughly 40 times the weight of a single dog. The pack brought it down anyway. Bush dogs were almost certainly present in Colombia's Llanos Orientales, the flooded savannas and gallery forests of the Orinoco Basin, for thousands of years before any European naturalist arrived to name them. They shaped the behaviour of their prey. Pacas moved differently because of them. Capybaras maintained specific retreat patterns because of them. The entire predator and prey network of the Eastern Plains had evolved around the presence of this small pack hunter, the way ecosystems always do when a coordinated carnivore is part of them. Then, through most of the 20th century, the scientific record on bush dogs in Colombia essentially went blank. Armed conflict consumed the eastern territories. The Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, the guerrilla organisation called the FARC, controlled vast areas across the Llanos and into the Amazon for more than 5 decades. Research expeditions were impossible. Camera trap networks could not be maintained. Field biologists faced kidnapping, extortion, or worse. The Llanos became one of the most biodiverse and least studied landscapes on Earth, simultaneously preserved and completely inaccessible to science. At the same time, cattle ranches replaced gallery forests in areas that were accessible. Domestic dogs, which spread diseases like distemper and parvovirus into any wild canid population they encounter, moved through rural communities across the region. Prey populations collapsed in areas under heavy hunting pressure. By the early 2000s, the documented scientific record on bush dogs in Colombia amounted to a handful of brief observations across 4 decades. A pack of 7 was seen at Tuparo National Park in January of 1980 in a chance encounter witnessed by ecologist Thomas Deffler and park director Dilva Pintor. A single record came from the Meta department in 2013. That was almost everything. The animal was invisible to science, and invisible is not the same as gone. But for the better part of 50 years, nobody could determine which one it was. The turning point did not happen in a laboratory. It happened on November the 24th, 2016, when the Colombian government and the FARC signed a final peace agreement ending 52 years of armed conflict. For wildlife biologists, the ceasefire that preceded it, declared in December of 2014, was the real inflection point. For the first time in most of their careers, Colombian researchers could consider entering territories that had been effectively sealed to science for half a century. Scientists who had spent entire professional lives studying Colombia's biodiversity from the edges of conflict zones now faced the prospect of actually going inside them. An analysis by Colombian botanist Oscar Alejandro Perez Escobar of the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew found that researchers published roughly 3 times more new plant species in Colombia each year after the peace agreement than they had before it. Biologists with the Wildlife Conservation Society, led in Colombia by scientific director German Forero, were able to use drone surveys to count critically endangered Orinoco crocodiles in territories that had simply been unreachable before. New frogs, new orchids, new beetles emerged from landscapes that had been scientifically invisible for 50 years. But the peace deal opened something else too. It opened the possibility of a long-term, systematic camera trap network across the Llanos Orientales and the adjacent Amazonian transition zone. And it was that network that brought the bush dogs back into the scientific record. The researchers who carried out the surveys that documented bush dog presence in Guaviare and Meta departments were part of a small community of Colombian mammalogists who had been waiting for exactly this moment. Not to make a dramatic announcement, just to go and look. To set cameras in the places they had always suspected were still supporting large mammal communities and see what was actually there. What they did was methodical and unglamorous. 36 camera traps were deployed in the Serranía de la Lindosa, a sandstone rock formation in the Guaviare department at the edge of the Colombian Amazon. 10 more were placed across the Altilanura, the high plains of the Orinoco Basin in Meta and Vichada departments. Both areas had been on the lists of Colombian ecologists for years. Both had been inaccessible. Going there meant coordinating with local communities who had long and complicated relationships with the armed groups that once controlled the territory. It meant moving through landscapes where the infrastructure for scientific work essentially did not exist. No maintained roads, no reliable communications, no field stations with refrigeration and power. The cameras were zip-tied to trees and posts near water, near the gallery forests that run along streams and rivers like arteries through the savannah. Boots sank into the dark, wet soil as researchers leaned into the ribbing of tree roots to find the angles that would capture the widest corridor. These forests are the highways of the Llanos. Every large mammal uses them. The cameras ran through the rains, through months of heat that warped the plastic housings, through nights when the battery indicators fell into the red. The researchers recorded results in units called captures per 100 trap nights. At the Serranía de la Lindosa, the capture rate for bush dogs was 0.18 per 100 trap nights. At the Llanos Orientales sites, it was 0.10 per 100 trap nights. These numbers sound modest. They are modest. They represent an animal that moves through the landscape in tight packs, leaving brief photographic traces of its passage before disappearing back into the forest. But the cameras caught them. And once they caught them, everything else the cameras had recorded began to make a different kind of sense. Here is the key insight that changed everything. Scientists studying post-conflict Colombia expected to find a degraded and simplified landscape. 50 years of guerrilla conflict, cattle ranching and illegal extraction had not left the Eastern Territories untouched. The models were not encouraging. The prevailing assumption, based on what had happened to other Latin American landscapes that emerged from conflict into rapid development, was that the large mammal communities of the Llanos would be fragmented, depleted, and retreating. What the cameras found was something different. Giant anteaters, which are themselves indicators of low hunting pressure and intact habitat, were documented at the same sites as the bush dogs. White-lipped peccaries, which often disappear from heavily hunted or degraded landscapes before almost any other large mammal does, were present. Giant armadillos, mountain lions, tapirs, ocelots. The Serranía de la Lindosa and the Llanos Orientales Altillanura had held on to a predator-prey community that most ecologists did not believe could still exist in the post-conflict transition zone. Scientists expected fragmentation and vacancy. What they found was a food web still functioning at multiple trophic levels. The bush dog's presence was the signal that mattered most. The bush dog does not persist in degraded landscapes. It requires intact gallery forest corridors. It requires prey populations that have not been hunted out. It requires the kind of ecological neighbourhood that includes peccaries and pacas and capybaras in numbers sufficient to sustain coordinated pack hunting. If the bush dogs were there, something had held the system together. And then researchers began to understand what that something was. Almost nobody connected it to the conflict at first. The FARC used the forest for cover. A cleared forest exposes troop movements and eliminates the routes needed for supply and retreat. The armed forces that controlled these territories for decades penalised excessive logging and hunting in the areas they depended on, not out of environmental conviction, out of military necessity. The inadvertent consequence of 50 years of armed control of remote territory was that some of Colombia's most biologically intact landscapes had been, in a brutal and unintended way, sealed from the industrial extraction that had transformed surrounding areas. Let me put that in context. A formal protected area costs millions of dollars to establish, staff, and enforce. Colombia's national park system, covering more than 34 million acres, has for decades operated at a fraction of the funding it needs. And yet adjacent territories under no formal protection at all, territories controlled by armed groups who had every reason to clear them and none to conserve them, had retained giant armadillos, tapirs, mountain lions, and pack-hunting canids that most biologists thought were gone. The data refused to fit the models. The system was not rebuilding itself after damage. It had never been as damaged as the models predicted, not the way engineers rebuild things, the way nature holds on, slowly, quietly, waiting for the cameras to arrive. There is a tension here that the discovery of bush dogs cannot resolve. It deserves honest acknowledgement. The same peace process that opened Colombia to science also opened it to the things that were waiting to move in. In the months following the ceasefire, deforestation surged across former conflict zones. Deforestation rose by roughly 40% in the first year after the FARC stood down in the areas it had previously controlled. Ranchers, miners, and illegal loggers moved into territories that the armed presence had effectively sealed from large-scale extraction. The result was a race between scientists trying to document what remained and economic interests trying to remove it. The bush dogs are still in the gallery forests of the Meta Department and the Guaviare sandstone outcrops for now. Both survey regions sit under growing pressure from cattle ranching expansion and agricultural conversion. Domestic dogs, carrying diseases that are lethal to wild canids, continue to move through rural communities on the edges of both areas. Here is a tension that conservation biology often handles badly. The communities living in these landscapes were themselves imprisoned by the conflict for 50 years. Smallholder farmers and indigenous communities, caught between armed groups and a state that could not protect them, were unable to leave and unable to develop their land. They raised cattle and crops in constant proximity to violence. These are the same communities now being asked to absorb the costs of protecting gallery forest corridors that international scientists and conservation organisations want to preserve. Cattle ranching is not an abstraction to a family that has few other options in a post-conflict landscape with no roads, no reliable markets, and no state services. Asking them to leave the forest standing while offering nothing in return is not conservation, it is displacement with a different name. The bush dog's survival in the Colombian Llanos depends on decisions being made right now about who pays for what and who benefits from the forest remaining. Those decisions are not being made by biologists. They are being made in local governments, by international commodity markets, and by the families clearing trees to plant grass. That is the unresolved part of this story. It will determine whether the cameras pick up bush dogs in those same gallery forests a decade from now. The image from the Serranía de la Lindosa still exists. A group of brown, muscular animals moving together in full daylight along a forest margin in a landscape that 50 years of conflict had sealed from science, and that 50 years of conflict had unintentionally kept intact. Colombia's wolves, doing what they have always done, hunting in packs, moving through gallery forests, waiting in rivers for prey to come to them. What the bush dog's reappearance in Colombia reveals is not complicated. It is not a story about nature recovering from human absence. It is a story about what science could not see. Not because it was not looking, because it could not reach where the animals had been all along. When the guns fell silent and the cameras went in, the animals were still there. Waiting. Alive. Fitting no one's expectations for what a post-conflict landscape should contain. Here is a detail that almost never makes it into the conversation. The bush dog was first described in the 1800s from fossils found in Brazilian caves. The Danish naturalist Peter Wilhelm Lund believed he was naming a prehistoric species, an animal that belonged to a lost age. It was only later, when living animals began to appear in the reports of startled fieldworkers across the neotropics, that the understanding shifted. The animal was not extinct, it had simply been somewhere that science had not managed to go. That is still, in many parts of the world, exactly where the most important animals are. The question that should stay with you is not whether the bush dogs will survive. That is genuinely uncertain and will depend on choices being made right now about how Colombia develops its post-conflict territories. The question is, how many other species are still out there, in the places that science has never been able to reach, and what we might find if we could get to them before the clearance does. What surprised you most about this story? Let me know in the comments below. And if you are not subscribed yet, now is the time. We cover stories about restoration and the people who are fixing what is broken. Hit subscribe. See you in the next one.